Welcome to Business Talk, a global podcast series where we bring you closer to some of the world's most distinguished scholars and their impactful ideas. I'm Deepak, your host from India. There is a particular kind of scholar who does not just study society from a distance, but walks right into the marketplace, the picket line, and the shopping aisle to understand how our everyday choices are entangled with power, inequality, and hope. Dr. Ted Skotnicki is one of those scholars. We are truly honored to welcome Dr. Ted Skotnicki to Business Talk. As an associate professor of sociology and at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, he spent his days guiding students through social theory, cultural sociology, and the tangled realities of global inequality and capitalism. In the classroom, ideas are never abstract. They are always tied back to how we live, buy, organize, and imagine changes in our own lives. Dr. Skotnicki's intellectual journey winds through some of the most rigorous academic environments in the United States. Trained as a sociologist at the University of California, San Diego, and shaped by earlier studies at the University of Chicago and the University of Notre Dame, he brings a rich blend of historical, philosophical, and comparative thinking to the study of modern social life. Over time, his curiosity has covered on one central question: how do people make moral sense of capitalism? To answer that, he dives into the world of social theory, consumption, social movements, and the history of ethical consumerism. Across his work, Dr. Skopninsky traces how campaigns around ethical purchasing and consumer activism have emerged as ways to confront exploitation and inequality within capitalist society. Rather than creating a boycott or a fair trade label as a simple gesture, he asks what these actions mean for the people who take them up and what they reveal about our desire to connect morality with markets. Drawing on historical sociology and the philosophy of social science, he follows the paths of everyday practices, buying, boycotting, and the act of solidarity to show how they think distance consumers to the hidden labor and supply chains behind the products we use. In these courses on classical and contemporary social theory, cultural analysis, and the politics of global capitalism, he invites students to look again at what seems ordinary and ask profound questions about the relationships between market, morality, and social change. In today's episode, Professor Ted Skotnicki takes us inside his fascinating book, The Sympathetic Consumer, Moral Critique in Capitalist Culture, and help us to see how something as simple as a purchase can become a site of ethical struggle and political imagination. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ted Skotnicki. It's a true privilege to hear. Welcome to Business Talk.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, Deepak.
Thank you. Professor, in the book you describe the moment when people pick up everyday goods like sugar, clothes, phones, and find almost no information about where they come from or who made them. Could you walk us through a concrete scene or example that first made you feel that strangeness of the anonymity in your own life?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess I'll just mention two. Um, First of them is that I grew up in Niagara Falls, New York, which was at the time that I was living there and still is a deindustrialized city. So all of the industries, many of the industries that had built its population up were declining. And so things happened a bit later in Niagara Falls than in other parts of the United States in some ways. And so for the first few years when I was in Niagara Falls, they had we didn't have any massive grocery stores, with thousands of different kinds of goods. We had mostly different versions of corner grocery stores. And I recall the period. I don't know how old I was, probably 5, 6, 7, when these mega grocery stores came in and gradually displaced all of the corner grocery stores, which were just small and had, uh, an arrangement of foodstuffs from, basically fresh fruit and produce to um, to a range of just sort of ordinary shopping food goods. And then we got these big mega grocery stores that had not just food, um, but all kinds of household goods, all kinds of toys, and that kind of experience was, it's kind of overwhelming to see all of these different goods from all of these different places that you know nothing about, and they're all in the same place, and they all come in the same way, and they leave in the same way. And that I think was a little puzzling to me as a kid, but I didn't really know how to interpret um, what it was. But then the second of these was that in college, I became involved with activism on campus. This was in the early 2000s, and one of the campaigns we were involved in was a boycott of the fast food chain Taco Bell, which was encouraged by a coalition of Immokalee workers. These are workers, largely Spanish-speaking workers, migrant workers in South Florida who are picking tomatoes. And so the groups that I was involved with, engaged in weekly protests outside of Taco Bell and encouraged boycotts of these fast food chains. And so these are two, I think, just kind of like simple scenes that illustrate, as we'll talk about in a little bit, I think, two dimensions of the kind of anonymity that that is characteristic of the purchase and engagement with goods in a capitalist society.
Professor, you argue that this encounter with anonymous commodities is not accidental, but an endemic feature of capitalist societies. How did you arrive at this conclusion? And what does it change in how we should think about capitalism compared to standard economic or moral narratives?
Um, Great, thank you. So I think I think there are two things that I'd want to respond to here in your question. The first is what it means to talk about anonymous commodities, and then the second will be to get at what is this when we think about these, when we take this idea of anonymous commodities seriously, what does that mean for our understanding of capitalism? So when I describe anonymous commodities as endemic, I'm I'm suggesting that they're anonymous in two senses, which one we can think of as kind of like roughly about quantity, how much, and then another that we can think of as about quality. Um, uh, and so there's a sense in which goods are anonymous in a capitalist society simply because the scale of the goods that people can buy and sell in a capitalist world has become so great. And so we're buying so many different things, and it's simply sort of like impossible. And many of these things come from other countries than the ones that we grew up in, or certainly not even even if they're not from different countries, they're from different regions of the countries where we are buying things. And so there's so many of these goods, it's kind of impossible to get a sense of who's making them and how they're making them. But the one thing about this kind of anonymity here is that this would have been true not just of capitalist societies, but of all kinds of societies prior to capitalism. There are trading networks around the Indian Ocean prior to the introduction of European trading networks and stuff. And there's like the Silk Road and the spice trade and all of these things that go across Europe into Asia and back. So that would have been true then too. So the anonymity can't just be that we can't see the people who are making our goods, because that's been true as long as there has been trade and encounters between people who are from different places. So I think the second sense of anonymity, the quality sense, is really important here. And this is connected to the idea that wealth takes the form of commodities. And this is kind of the thing that I was pointing to when I discussed that the massive grocery stores that were introduced into Niagara Falls when I was growing up. And and in that grocery store, all of these different goods are in an important sense equal. they all have a price, and they, even if they come from different places, and even if the labor that goes into them looks very different, they're all nevertheless the same kind of thing in a sense. And it's that idea that in a capitalist society, wealth takes the form of commodities. And there's something fundamentally anonymous about those commodities, as in that when we buy and sell them, we treat them as equal to all of the other commodities. And this is a sort of like structuring principle or feature of a capitalist society. So these are the two senses of anonymity that I'm talking about in the book. So how then do I arrive at this sense of anonymity? Well, I would describe this anonymity as an inference, which is grounded in archival research that I've done, as well as a lot of secondary literature and reading. And I'll talk about some of the examples from the archival materials later. But this inference about anonymous goods helps to explain the form that consumer activism takes in a capitalist world. So that's the first answer part of the question. The second part is, all right, so if we take this idea of anonymous goods seriously, what does this suggest about how we should think about capitalism? And I would highlight 2 points, and they're connected. The first is that we shouldn't think about capitalism as an economy. In other words, capitalism doesn't merely describe the organizations and practices that are associated with the production, distribution, exchange, and consumption of goods or wealth. Instead, we should think of it as a world system and a form of life, as associated not just with an economy, but with a state. So particular forms of governance, with cultures, with particular ways of living. And so it suggests here that we think about capitalism in a more comprehensive way, as not simply referring to economic features of social life, but referring to other things that touch on all other dimensions of our lives. The second, then, important point is that by implication, we should also consider morality as taking particular forms in capitalism. So I think it's very common for people to see things that they don't like about capitalism from all kinds of political perspectives, whether on the right or on the left, and to claim that part of what's wrong with capitalism is that morality is absent. But I think it's actually more accurate if you take this idea of anonymous goods seriously. I think it's more accurate to state that morality can take specifically capitalist forms. And so in the book, what I try to show is how features of capitalist life can elicit or entail and shape morality in particular ways.
Professor, one of the striking moves in the book is to place 18th century British abolitionist boycotts of slave ground sugar alongside 20th century consumer movements and contemporary fair trade campaigns. When you compare these three movements across 3 centuries, what was the most surprising similarity that you found?
Um, Great. I think the simplest one will have to do with trying to explain this form that I'll talk about in a little bit, the sympathetic consumer, which is the title of the book. But when I started the research for this book, I thought I was going to try to explain why consumer activism developed differently in the United States and the United Kingdom at the turn of the 20th century, or turn of the end of the 19th into the early 20th century. Because there was a National Consumers League in the United States, and there was a Consumers League in England that was actually the model for the National Consumers League in the United States. But then the one in England dissipated. Nothing happened with it. And so I thought I was going to try to figure out why there was this robust consumer activist movement in the United States and not so much in England. But as I looked into turn of the 20th century activism, I noticed a recurring theme. So in the various groups that I started to identify, the National Consumers League, the Cooperative Wholesale Society, the Women's Cooperative Guild, about which I'll try to say some more later, um, all of these groups lamented their inability to see into the conditions of production. And I started to think about this um, as something that wasn't just happening in this period at the turn of the 20th century, but I started to look backwards in time toward the abolitionist movement, and then I started to look forwards in time toward fair trade movements. And so I thought I was going to look at all of these different groups that involved different people. There were different classes, there were different genders, there were different organizations, there were different ideologies associated with these groups. And I thought I would see all these kinds of variations. But what I saw was yes, there were all those variations, but they all also took the same kind of form. And this basic crucial similarity is that their politics, that is, their visions, the kind of like strategies that they undertake to enact these visions and the kind of like moral sensibilities that they have were all organized around the consumer. And so this is the thing that they to my mind they all fundamentally shared in spite of all of the differences between these groups.
Professor, you developed the figure of the sympathetic consumer as someone who relates to distant producers through commodities themselves. If you were to explain this figure to an everyday shopper in a supermarket, how would you describe who the sympathetic consumer is and what makes them distinct?
Yeah, this is a good question, and I suppose the simplest way in would be to ask someone, have you ever wondered where the goods that you buy come from? And some people will say yes, and some people will say no. I just buy them or whatever else. But it's a question that still, even if you haven't really thought about it, the moment someone asks you, it can make a certain kind of sense. And the sympathetic consumer um, is a collective attempt to organize social change around this question, where your goods come from and who made them and how they got to you. And so um, and so the it's a specific kind of question that interestingly we don't see in the historical record of human civilizations until basically the 18th century. In the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, there are some early attempts to encourage what some people have called long distance advocacy. So people in the Spanish Empire, for instance, began to mobilize. Not so much around consumerism, but attempts to appeal to royalty and governors and others who were involved in colonization to change the treatment of indigenous people in the Americas. So there were versions of this that were starting to emerge with the sort of like European colonization that starts in the 15th and 16th centuries. But you don't get this kind of politics organized around the consumer and where goods come from until basically the last third of the 18th century. And so this is a relatively new thing in human history. And so there have been all kinds of politics throughout human history that involve consumption, but we don't see this kind of systematic attempt to organize politics around the consumer, around where the goods they buy come from and how they are produced until the last 250 years of human history.
Professor, the book shows activists using very creative tactics to make invisible labor visible through pamphlets, labels, images, and even sensory appeals. Could you share a favorite historical example of these ways of seeing and what it reveals about how sympathy is actually cultivated?
Yeah. Um, so so I'll point out a couple of them. Um, and I'll kind of divide them in the book. I divide them into, I use the terms imaginative and sensuous. But the thing that I'm trying to get at here is something like appeals that are or strategies for encouraging this sympathetic consumption that rely on people's imagination and their capacity to reason on the one hand, and then appeals that actually sort of like work through people's immediate senses, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, um, and so I'll start with the rational example, and um, this one comes from a pamphlet that was published in 1791 by an abolitionist named Thomas Cooper. And so this is one of the first major cases that I use in the book. The abolitionists in the early 1790s started this anti-sugar campaign that was all around the slave production of sugar. And and so what Cooper does, and I'm going to read a few passages from this pamphlet. What he does is he tries to present a picture that connects consumers to the sugar plantations. I'll read a couple passages here. So he writes, the average import of slaves into the European colonies maybe 100,000. And this is a speculative calculation here. But these are only 2/3 of the import previous to seasoning, for 1/3 dies in the seasoning. Seasoning is a term that was used to describe the period when enslaved people were introduced into the plantations, and it was usually about 2 years, and a lot of people would die. And so this is what he's describing. Therefore, the actual import into the European colonies is at this rate 150,000. But this latter number is only 4/5 of the cargo when first laden in Africa. For 1/5 at least dies in the passage. Therefore, the cargo when first laden was 180,000 men. Moreover, it has been observed before that for one man actually sent down the coast, at the very least 10 were slaughtered. Hence, 1,800,000 people are annually murdered at the instigation of Europeans. Next, he writes, the most callous heart cannot reflect upon this circumstance without emotion, and everyone who possesses a common degree of humanity is ready to imprecate the vengeance of heaven upon the authors and abettors of such unparalleled barbarity. What then must be his anguish on finding that he himself has, thoughtlessly indeed, but really, been accessory to the crime and is partaker in the guilt? And then to explain this, he says the following. For why is the slave trade carried on? To supply the West India planters with hands to cultivate the islands. And why are the islands cultivated? To furnish the inhabitants of Europe with sugar. If sugar were not consumed, it would not be imported. If it were not imported, it would not be cultivated. If it were not cultivated, there would be an end to the slave trade, so that the consumer of sugar is really the prime mover, the grand cause of all the shocking cruelty which accompanies the treatment of the wretched African slaves. And so there's this description that allows consumers to imagine, but also connects them, shows or tries to embed them in these networks of production, distribution, and exchange. And so you see this kind of strategy with varying degrees of precision again and again in forms of consumer activism from this period on. And so that's I think it's a particularly striking and well articulated version of the kind of reasoning and the kind of imagination that these activists wanted to try to cultivate. The sort of more mundane examples that I think are very telling were the use of exhibits at the turn of the 20th century. So the National Consumers League in the United States, a group of predominantly women largely upper class women who were worried about sweatshop labor, and then the Cooperative Wholesale Society and the Women's Cooperative Guild in the United Kingdom, they used a strategy. But they used labels and all these other things that we still see now in fair trade and other kinds of stuff. But they also were interested and used exhibits. So they would use lantern slides. So early versions of, I guess, what we would now say things like PowerPoint or whatever else. But they would use lantern slides and have lectures where they would show what the tenements looked like, what garments were produced in sweatshop-based tenements. They would show what a good site of production would look like, whether that's again like garments, whether it was cacao, whether it was tea. So they would exhibit and share and have these events where people could come and see and touch and experience the goods and try to get a sense of how much they couldn't know or couldn't see on the basis of just going into the store and trying to purchase these things. And so you see a range of these strategies, again, different versions of them, and they change with the times, but they draw on new technologies and new strategies to do basically the same thing, which is to get people to try to imagine themselves in relation to other people and to imagine themselves as in a way that is emotionally connected to those people. So it's a combination of the sort of like rational idea that you might imagine what the structure of the world looks like that you're connected to, but then also emotionally that you should feel something for those people who are in other parts of the world whom you can't encounter in some way.
Professor, you draw on Marx's notion of commodity fetishism to explain why the sympathetic consumer keeps reappearing across different eras. In your view, what does Marx help us see about consumer activism that more optimistic accounts of ethical consumption might miss?
Yeah, I think the thing that Marx really helps to make clear, in my view, is the way that the sympathetic consumption is, in a certain sense, part of the furniture of a capitalist world. So it's certainly based on a moral sentiment, and it's certainly based on a desire to change things. But what Marx draws our attention to is that, well, part of what this is dealing with symptoms. You're dealing with symptoms. You're putting a Band-Aid on something that is, a severed arm. And a Band-Aid is not necessarily going to sort of like solve the fundamental problem of what severed the arm and how it got there. And so I think that Marx helps us to look at these kinds of projects more systemically. And I will say I'm not the most optimistic person in a lot of ways, but I also don't want to denigrate consumer activism. I think it can be very helpful, and I think I don't want to say it is useless. But what I want to say is that Marx can help us attend to the ways that the kind of activism that we may find ourselves drawn to at certain moments may have more to do with the kind of like structure of the world that we live in than it may have to do with the sort of like finding sustainable solutions to those problems. And so I think Marx is helpful for drawing our attention to that aspect of consumer activism.
Professor, activists in these movements often grounded their moral arguments in both religious traditions and secular ideas of justice, especially Christianity in the abolitionist and early consumer movements. How did this moral and religious background shape what they taught consumers on to invisible laborers?
This is a really important question because I've started the conversation by, and your questions have pointed initially, right, to the ways that this consumer activism seems to be, in a certain sense, totally determined by a capitalist society. It can feel like, oh, okay, well, you're just advocating here a systemic view, and you don't care at all really about morality and all of the different ways and things that might motivate people. But I actually think these two perspectives are the sort of like concern with the details of morality and why people are motivated to do the things that they are, and this kind of like systemic perspective on capitalism are can be integrated. And so this question about religion draws attention to some of the differences that are crucial to the development of this kind of capitalist morality and politics. So so you're absolutely right here that the groups that I'm looking at often were animated by different religious and sometimes non-religious moral principles. The abolitionists in England at the turn of the 18th century, or turn of the 19th century, excuse me, were predominantly and quite explicitly motivated by Christian principles. So the reason in many cases that they advocated people should refrain from buying sugar from the Caribbean was because they should be concerned about the status of their souls in some way, and they should be concerned about the status of the souls of those in the plantations as well. So, and this was very explicit. At the same time, they also, when they tried to convince people, they didn't exclusively rely on Christian rhetoric and argumentation. So, well, there's one pamphlet that is really fascinating from, again, the early 1790s that was addressed to the Duchess of York, Frederica Charlotta, who is the wife of Frederick, who is the second son of George III, the King of England at the time. And they appealed to the Duchess of York, and they said, would you consider not consuming sugar? And the reasons that they gave were, well, we think that this it's bad that people are suffering and all for the sugar that you consume in your tea and your coffee, but they didn't say that this would work because everyone would behave like good Christians. They said that this would work because if the Duchess publicly refused to consume this kind of sugar, then other royals would themselves no longer consume this sugar. And then the middling classes who look up to the royals would not. And so this is more of a sociological argument about why people should not do this. And so it's very interesting, right, that even these devout Christians don't exclusively rely on Christian moral reasoning. And then by the time you get to the turn of the 20th century, you get less explicit Christian moral motivations among some of these consumer activists. So some of the key organizers of the National Consumers League in the U.S., for instance, were dedicated socialists and were non-religious. But they often made more utilitarian arguments where they would say, in effect, well, why should you not consume goods that are made in sweatshops, because it basically produces more harm than good. And so one of the interesting things then is that we see different reasons why people might be motivated to participate in this kind of activism. But what's also interesting is that they also take the same form. So even though there are different motivations, even though there's different religious backgrounds, I mean, you could think about it, right? Another example that I'm sure you know quite a bit about is like the Swadeshi movement, right? Which is a movement, again, like the different backgrounds that are involved in the formulation of these demands, but it's a demand to say that, like, well, it's an attempt to build self-determination that is bound up with what you buy and where you buy it, and how those things are produced and where the money goes, and these kinds of questions. And so we can see different traditions with different kinds of moral sensibilities, nevertheless formulating these concerns in the same kind of way. And so that is, I think, important. So you can see both the differences and the similarities in that example of the different kinds of religious backgrounds here.
Professor, in the turn of the 20th century movements you study, organizations like the National Consumer League and the cooperative movement face real internal conflicts over class, gender, and organizational priorities. What did those struggles teach you about the limits of consumer activism and who gets to speak up in the name of the consumer?
Yeah, this is another question that gets at the same kind of problem, right? Which is that while this is a kind of common form that you can see across different places and times in capitalist societies, nevertheless, there are going to be real conflicts and variations depending on who the people are who are engaged in these projects. So, for instance, the cooperative movement understood themselves to be fundamentally a working class movement, and there were two groups in the cooperatives that I was dealing with. The Cooperative Wholesale Society, and they owned and operated stores throughout England and Scotland and Ireland. Starting in the last half of the 19th century. And then there was the Women's Cooperative Guild. The Women's Cooperative Guild was a collection of women who were organizing to try to create a space for women to take part in the cooperative movement, because the cooperative movement was masculine. Most places until the early 20th century did not allow women to be members of cooperative stores. And so the Women's Cooperative Guild was organized to try to build a place for women to take real part in the cooperative movement. And so there were conflicts between the Women's Cooperative Guild and the Cooperative Wholesale Society over questions of gender. So the Women's Cooperative Guild sometimes advocated for things like eliminating laws that prevented divorce, for instance, and the Cooperative Wholesale Society didn't want to run afoul of specific religious organizations that wanted to keep these divorce laws in place, and so they would fight over these kinds of questions. But there's a really interesting difference that crops up between the Cooperative Wholesale Society and Women's Cooperative Guild over the role of labor. So there's a conflict in the early 20th century between the Cooperative Wholesale Society and the National Union of Boot and Shoe Operators, which was basically a trade union of people who made boots and shoes. And they wanted to create, the National Union of Boot and Shoe Operators wanted to create a label that they would put on shoes that they would give to people who paid a fair wage and kept their work conditions clean and healthy for the workers, and also that had a closed union shop, which meant that the only people that they would employ were people who were members of the union. The Cooperative Wholesale Society wanted to get this label from the National Union of Boot and Shoe Operators for goods that they made that were sold in their stores, boots and shoes that were sold in cooperative stores. But they opposed the idea of what was called a closed shop. They thought that this violated the freedom of individual choice. So the Cooperative Wholesale Society refused to budge and therefore did not get this label from the boot and shoe operators. By contrast, the Women's Cooperative Guild supported the boot and shoe operators and attempted to encourage them. And so one of the things that this shows is that when you are committed, for instance, to the consumer as the single most important site of social change, this is invariably going to conflict with other aspects of life, like, for instance, labor. And so, in certain instances, the cooperatives, while they saw themselves as a group of working class people, nevertheless made decisions that prioritized the consumer over the labor. And so this is one of the fundamental limits about who gets to speak in the name of the consumer, especially when you commit yourself to a kind of politics where the consumer has priority. A second kind of concern that doesn't so much come from this example, but is in the background of the book in general, has to do with the sort of like um, focus in my book on two imperial powers, right? England or Great Britain, and then the United States. And so there's an important question here about who gets to speak in the name of the consumer, because some people who are not speaking in most of these circumstances are the workers in other parts of the world who are making these things. So the consumer speaks, but the worker necessarily sometimes doesn't. And so this is something that's also important to keep in mind for this kind of consumer activism, is that sometimes based on where you start, you assume certain things and you allow certain people to speak, and other people are not allowed to speak.
The final chapter connects historical forms of the sympathetic consumer to contemporary fair trade and conscious capitalism. When you look at today's ethical brands and certifications, where do you see genuine continuities with earlier activism, and where do you see important breaks or even co-optation?
All right. Great. Yeah. So I think the most important continuity is basically in this form where you still see the form of the sympathetic consumer, where there is a vision of what the world looks like, where the consumer plays a fundamental role, that many of the problems that we see can be traced back to the way people buy and sell things. That then there's a set of strategies that are connected to that vision, which involve things like trying to expose the conditions of production for people. And this is, you can see this. There are all kinds of new ways that people use contemporary information technologies to help reveal or expose the conditions under which things are bought and sold. And then there's a similar kind of moral form to the argument, where they talk you through what your connections are to these people, and then identify the consumer as morally responsible. So this is, I think, more or less consistent from in the different ways that and periods in which and places in which this activism develops from the late 18th century into the present. So that's the continuity. Where I see the breaks then have to do with largely scope and scale. The sheer range of things that can be bought and sold, and the number of people who are drawn into these networks of buying and selling are increasingly complicated and baroque. So you have goods that are where the materials are sourced in one continent, and then they are processed in another continent, and then they travel multiple places within that continent, and then they're sold worldwide in different ways, right? And so you have this this sort of like immense complexity of the supply chain. But then you also have this, I think, ability of corporations to control access to information and to places that you didn't see it in the turn of the 20th century and in the early abolitionist movement. Many of these groups that I was looking at, the historical cases, they were able to negotiate and find ways to access workplaces and gain information about workplaces. But, if you think about the struggles around things like Amazon warehouses around the world, those are tightly controlled. And it is very hard for people to get in and get information. So you have that kind of like structural difference, both the supply chains and then the sort of like corporate control. But then the other really important difference is that the earlier forms of organization were effectively they were broad forms of public activism, that people were expected to participate in local organizations. They were expected to try to gain information about workplaces. They were expected to try to sort of like participate in meetings and whatever else. And so it was this broader sort of like social organizational form that we saw consumer activism taking in the period from the late 18th through the middle of the 20th century, and now it's become increasingly, I think, individualized. And so that would be that, and that I think speaks to the kind of like co-optation that you're pointing to. So while the form is the same, I can just go to the store without being a member of any groups or having any expectations placed on me, and I can buy certain kinds of fair trade goods and then feel like I'm doing something to improve working conditions without any other kind of demands being placed on me. And I think that's a real difference.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Your book ultimately offers a way to identify capitalist culture by examining how people interpret everyday phenomena like shopping and branding. If listeners wanted to use your framework in their own lives, what kind of everyday moments or decisions would you invite them to pay attention to? And what questions should they start asking themselves as a consumer?
So I think really the most important question here is not it's not I don't intend to turn people to paralyze people to prevent them, to say that, well, don't ever care about where your goods come from. I think the really important question is to reflect on why our intuitions about how politics should look and how it can work so often seem to run through the consumer. Um, that's the thing that I would that so it's a critical question, but it's not meant to say you should never engage in consumer politics of this type and that you shouldn't care about where your goods come from. But it should induce this kind of question to think like, well, if the way that I respond to political issues, to things I don't like, things that I think are wrong or unfair about the world, is primarily to think about what I can do in my capacity as a consumer, then I'm thinking in a way that is entirely consistent with the organization of a capitalist society. And so we need to be able to place that intuition that I think is a normal feature of a world where buying and selling is something that most of us do, at least on a weekly basis, if not daily for some. Um, I think that we need to be able to place that intuition in context, and that's kind of what this book is intending to do for people, is to raise that question.
Thank you, Professor Ted Skotnicki, for this enlightening conversation and for helping to see how something as ordinary as shopping can open up profound questions about morality and capitalism. Your work on the sympathetic consumer challenges us to look beyond the price tag and ask who and what we are really connected to when we consume. To our listeners, we hope today's conversation and discussion inspire you to notice the hidden histories behind everyday goods and to think more carefully about the kind of economic world your choices help sustain. Thank you for joining us on Business Talk. Thank you once again, Professor Ted.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you.